George Steinbrenner died yesterday, 2010. Because he was smart enough to die in 2010, there is zero tax liability to the estate tax.
Republican Senator Jim Bunning, as ever, keeping it classy. He says George Steinbrenner was smart enough to die yesterday so his family could avoid paying taxes on his estate because of a loophole in the Bush tax laws. In Jim Bunning's rush to use the death of a man who had been dead for only about 24 hours in order to make his case against the estate tax, you can see both Jim Bunning's classiness and the Republican Party's enthusiasm for talking about what they think is now going to be their issue for this upcoming election. Yes, there's going to be a fight about immigration and about Republicans berating unemployed people for being unemployed. Yes, there will be a fight about energy. But the big issue you can see Republicans getting geared up for now is taxes, specifically the George W. Bush tax cuts. The 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts are set to expire at the end of this year. Everybody panic! And Republicans right now are psyched to campaign on extending the Bush tax cuts, on making them permanent. In Florida, for example, Republican Senate hopeful Marco Rubio just released his 12-step plan to fix the economy. 12 ideas he says will get the economy going again. Marco Rubio's idea number one, permanently extend the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. And it's not just the Bush tax cuts that Republicans are psyched to run on. It's the whole Bush tax agenda. Marco Rubio put all of these things down as his ideas, but they're not really just his. The person we have drafted as his tax spokesman tonight can actually help us through these. For example, Marco Rubio idea number two, cut taxes on American businesses. By cutting this tax, we can spur job creation in America. Mr. Spokesman?
Tax relief is right. And tax relief is urgent. Help for small business means jobs for Americans.
Also, Marco Rubio idea number three, permanently end the death tax. Mr. Spokesman?
We must repeal the death tax.
Marco Rubio idea number six, fundamentally reform the U.S. tax code. He says, quote, the U.S. should have a tax system that is simpler, or as the spokesman says,
we simplified the tax code by reducing the number of tax rates from the current 5 rates to 4.
Beyond carrying on the Bush economic and tax agenda that worked out so awesome, other Marco Rubio ideas track very closely with what House Republicans have proposed this year, things like ending taxes on dividends and capital gains and reforming the alternative minimum tax. Taxes is what Republicans want to run on. The problem is they also want to run on being against the deficit.
The American people are saying to us, you're spending too much, you're running up too many debts, and we expect you to do something about it.
I see no shame in wanting to lower the debt off the backs of our kids. I think that's a good conversation to have with America right now.
Republicans want to be the anti-deficit and anti-debt party right now, but they also want to run on George Bush's tax policies. And that is the giant awkwardness at the heart of Republicanism right now. Because George W. Bush's tax policies did to the deficit what the I only eat fried cheese diet does to your cholesterol. In 2001, the first Bush tax cuts cost $1.3 trillion. 2 years later, Republicans passed another round of Bush tax cuts at a cost of $350 billion. Neither of those tax cuts was paid for. They just added them onto the deficit. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch admitted to the Associated Press back in December that during the Bush years, quote, it was standard practice not to pay for things. It certainly added to the deficit, no question. In 2005, the Congressional Budget Office looked at the impact of the Bush tax cuts and estimated that they added $539 billion to the deficit that 1 year alone. If it wasn't for the Bush tax cuts, the U.S. in that year would have had a budget surplus, not a deficit. Do you remember how George Bush sold the tax cuts in the first place? He essentially said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We can afford to cut taxes. We got a surplus. It'll be fine.
The growing surplus exists because taxes are too high and government is charging more than it needs. The people of America have been overcharged, and on their behalf, I'm here asking for a refund.
got that and more, and we got a huge deficit to show for it. Remember when they would complain about surpluses? Yeah. So now, how do you run as a Republican who's in favor of extending the deficit bomb that was Bush's tax policies and also say you're against the deficit? You do that by magic. Republicans are now arguing with a straight face that tax cuts just magically don't affect the deficit at all. On Sunday, Republican Senator Jon Kyl argued that you should never actually have to pay for tax cuts. And now the top Republican in the Senate is backing him up. Mitch McConnell telling Talking Points memo today that tax cuts don't have to be paid for because, quote, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Bush tax cuts actually diminished revenue. They increased revenue. Despite all of the empirical evidence to the contrary, Republicans are now arguing that tax cuts are good for the deficit, just like fried cheese is good for your cholesterol. You heard Mitch McConnell there say that tax cuts increase revenue to the government. He's making the case that cutting revenue increases revenue. Also, cats love baths. Even George W. Bush's former chief economist has called bullpucky on this sort of ridiculous logic. He wrote recently, quote, I did not find such a claim credible based on the available evidence. I never have, and I still don't. As our friend Ezra Klein wrote today at the Washington Post, what is helpful about all of this magical thinking about math and deficits is that the Republicans are at least making these claims openly now. Guys like Marco Rubio and the House Republicans and Jon Kyl and Mitch McConnell, they're writing this stuff down. They are saying it on tape, and that lets us show what they are really offering. So here it is, including the math. Here's what Republicans are campaigning on. Right now, the national deficit stands at about $1 trillion. That's what we're at. That's where we're at right now if nothing happens. What happens if Republicans get elected and they do what they say they're going to do? Well, first, they say they want to permanently extend the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts. So, right? That's fair enough there over the deficit? Did I get that up right? So they want to... What? Yeah. That's good. Okay. Well, I knew that was going to happen. Wait. Hold on. How's that? See, our wall is slightly less magic. All right, there we go. They permanently extend the 01 and 03 tax cuts. Hey, Rich, can you help me out? Can you help me out? Will you help me with this? There you go. Hold that. All right. That would add $2.3 trillion to the national deficit. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. As you saw from Marco Rubio, Republicans also want to repeal the alternative minimum tax, or the AMT. They also want to permanently end the estate tax and the gifts tax. Doing those three things would tack on another $1.1 trillion or so onto the deficit. The first thing that wasn't a tax cut in Marco Rubio's 12-point plan was repealing Obamacare, repealing health reform. You hear that from a lot of Republicans right now, including the top Republican in the House, John Boehner. If you did that, you would add another... $19 billion, you'd add another $138 billion to the deficit. The next idea from Marco Rubio was another Republican favorite, to prevent cap-and-trade energy legislation from becoming law. If you do that, I bet this is the only one that will actually stick. Rich, watch this. If you do that, you add another $19 billion to the deficit. So that is a grand total of $3.5 trillion. This is what Republicans are proposing to add to the deficit. Right now, our deficit is around $1 trillion. Republicans are proposing to add $3.5 trillion more to it. Thank you very much. Now let them all fall down. Well done. There we go. Don't let the door hit your fiscal responsibility when you're on your way out. All right. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. Senator Brown, thank you for joining us tonight.
You're having too much fun, Rachel.
I am having too much fun. Whenever things fail visibly on television, I enjoy myself.
You do. And we do.
Well, thank you. Let me ask, though, if there is something that I'm missing aside from good double-stick tape, are Republicans essentially campaigning on adding all this tax cut stuff to the deficit?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, what you're missing is you're only telling half the story, and you're in this way that not only what they're doing provably increases the deficit, and did increase the deficit in the first several years of this decade, this century. We know that. You proved that. We knew that. What else it did is it doesn't create jobs. Just contrast the last two 8-year administrations. During the 8 Bush years, 3 million jobs, net jobs created. During the 8 Clinton years, 22 million net jobs created. So I care about deficits, absolutely. But what I care even more about is job creation, that people have a chance to join the middle class. We saw jobs created, 22 million in the Clinton years, because they were responsible about cutting taxes selectively and increasing taxes selectively, and were responsible about what government programs they formed and they dismantled. 22 million jobs created, and incomes went up in those 8 years for the average American. Then the next 8 years, the 8 Bush years, only 3 million jobs created, and that wasn't even enough to keep up with population growth. So in that sense, there was a relative decline in job creation.